Coming Out, Moving Forward, Wisconsin's Recent Gay History by Richard Wagner. First of all, we need to thank our partners, Hedberg Public Library, YWCA Rock County, Community Action Incorporated, UW-Madison Division of Extension Rock County, and the NAACP. I can't see the whole screen here. What do I need to do? Oh, I see. Here we go. Sorry.
Move it.
We would like to recognize that we are meeting on the ancestral lands of Native nations. In Wisconsin, there are 11 federally recognized Native American sovereign nations and one seeking to regain federal recognition. We acknowledge these indigenous communities who have stewarded this land for 20,000 years and pay respect to their elders past and present. The way we will run this presentation is for all of you to stay muted when the speaker is speaking. We need to hear everything he has to say, so please stay muted. But if you do have questions, please write them in the chat as we go. The questions in the chat will all be saved so that after our speaker has completed his presentation, then we will start the Q&A. As we have said, this session is being recorded, so please enjoy this presentation and thank you for joining us tonight. We are certainly honored to welcome this evening Richard Wagner, who is a Wisconsin author, scholar, and activist.
I saw his name.
He was, please everyone have your audio muted right now.
You have to mute it.
Susan, you muted your own.
Hello?
Yeah, now you're unmuted.
Oh, okay, sorry. Got it. Gosh. All right. Tonight, we are very honored to welcome Richard Wagner, a Wisconsin author, scholar, and activist. He was the first openly gay member of the Dane County Board of Supervisors, and he served there for 14 years. In 1983, and this was groundbreaking, he was appointed by Governor Tony Earl to co-chair the Governor's Council on Lesbian and Gay Issues, the very first in the nation. In 2005, he joined the board of Fair Wisconsin to fight the constitutional amendment against marriage equality. Wagner has served on numerous boards in the state of Wisconsin: the Arts Board, the Humanities Committee, the Board of Downtown Madison, the Madison Planning Commission, the Madison Urban Design Commission, the Madison Landmarks Commission and Historic Madison, the Madison Trust for Historic Preservation, the Board of Olbrich Botanical Gardens, and the Board of the Friends of UW Libraries. He is also the author of the first edition of the history, We've Been Here All Along, Wisconsin's Early Gay History, published by Wisconsin Historical Society in 2019. These both volumes are groundbreaking works, being as sweeping and as scholarly as they are. I am a member of the Janesville City Council. I am also on the Sustainable Janesville Committee and the Hedberg Library Board. I'm very active in the Janesville League of Women Voters, the Diversity Action Team of Rock County, and the Green Rock Audubon Society. I've been an activist since my college days. First of all, fighting for women's rights, and then later on, environmental protection and conservation of wildlife and water. I am published in the Capital Times Madison and in various newsletters around the state. And we will begin. I just want to say this topic is of particular importance to me because I also identify as gay, and I wanted to make sure that we had a program on this topic for Rock County. So thank you and start.
Okay, Amy, now I do the screen share thingy, I think.
Yes, if you hover around the bottom, there should be a green icon
did that.
says share
So,
screen. If
okay,
you click on that one time, then it should show you some options of things you can share with us. If you double click on your presentation, it should appear for all of us.
I don't seem to have the option of bringing the PowerPoint up. It's behind this. Desktop 1, is that what I want? No. Okay. No sharing. You see the presentation at this point?
Yes.
There you go.
Okay, I'll put it in presenter view and okay, we're good, right? Yay. I'm all thumbs when it comes to this technology stuff. So anyway.
We're seeing your preview, so you're going to want to change the view.
Oh, okay, it's on presenter view. Now I don't see where I don't have those commands in front of me right now. Can you just manage to try this, or rather than me lose it all? Why don't I just start talking and then I'll advance it as it goes and try not to be too distracted by the extra slides. Okay, I've entitled this talk, Wisconsin, a Gay Laboratory for Democracy, because I wanted to draw on one of the concepts from the progressive period, which was that the states in this federal union could be laboratories for democracy. And I think Wisconsin in the period following Stonewall was a unique gay laboratory in these United States. And I will explain that through the talk and explain why historically that was important. The very concept of the Laboratory for Democracy goes back to the days of Bob La Follette being governor of Wisconsin. He had invited Lincoln Steffens, one of the muckrakers, to come to Wisconsin and see the reforms that Bob La Follette was instituting here. And he stayed at the old governor's residence with the La Follette family. And he became very supportive of the La Follette reforms and talked about, and others in the progressive period talked about how the states were changing things, testing new ideas for our democracy as we had become bigger and had a stronger plutocratic kind of economy. And Wisconsin was in the lead in many of those areas, led by Bob La Follette and other progressives. So it's that concept of how Wisconsin can take a leadership role that I want to borrow from this concept of the Laboratory of Democracy. In the first volume, which was mentioned, we've been here all along, I tried to show how, I don't know what happened, something strange happened, but we'll try this. Maybe I can now, I can maybe get a command. I can get this in here, no. Okay, we're in slideshow view, I guess. Okay, we've been here all along. I tried to show how a number of Wisconsin's early gays and lesbians actually participated in liberation before Stonewall. They found ways to affirm their own identities, to remove the repression that had been put on them, both legal and social, and they formed networks of support. And so, in a sense, they weren't waiting for Stonewall, they undertook their own liberation. Oh, okay, whoops. Now, one of the people that I talked about in the first volume was Ted Pierce, who was an African-American gentleman who lived on Williamson Street for almost all of his nearly 100 years. And he had been pretty much an out gay man since the 1930s in this town, made connections with other gay men, built networks, and was part of an integrated gay circle on Jennifer Street on Madison's east side. And was one of those typical people I found who liberated themselves and didn't wait for Stonewall to occur. Another person was Lorraine Hansberry, who attended the University of Wisconsin. She lived at Langdon Manor, and shown here with her housemates in the university yearbook. But she studied theater at the university, and so before her famous play, A Raisin in the Sun, hit Broadway, she had been mixing with progressive and gay circles here in the city. And so that was part of her background as well. There wasn't a lot of political activity. There's individual liberation that was occurring before Stonewall, but there was some. I don't know, let's see.
Dick, let me interrupt you just
Yes.
very briefly. I'm sharing your screen so we can get the full view of it. So you
Okay.
just let me know when you want to advance.
Okay, let's advance then. There was a little political activity, and one of it was in 1966, the Wisconsin Young Democrats meeting in Manitowoc, represented by the Badger Ferry here crossing Lake Michigan from Manitowoc, adopted a plank at their statewide convention, which called for basically abolishing the criminal penalties for homosexuality. This sex plank in 1966, this is like 4 years before Stonewall, became quite a controversy. And it showed sort of an awakening in a political sense that liberation had to be more than just personal. Also before Stonewall, the Daily Cardinal in February of '69, remember Stonewall doesn't happen until June, had this story about a homophile league on the Madison campus, had issued a series of demands for more coursework and information about homosexuals that should occur on the Madison campus. So these little stirrings had occurred in this state of Wisconsin well before the nation was sort of galvanized by Stonewall. And then you did have Stonewall in June of 1969. And David Carter, who wrote the prime book about the Stonewall, the riots that sparked the gay revolution, actually had a background here in Madison where he did graduate work. And he was also involved with gay TV efforts and with the United here in this city. And so some of the gay liberation that did happen in Madison following Stonewall helped lead to the definitive history about Stonewall itself, which David Carter wrote later on in his life. But you also had a series of young men deciding who they were and being more open about it. A group of gay men standing on a building, in front of a building on Gilman Street that was colloquially known as Fag Manor because of its sort of gay commune nature. And some of these had been active in the early gay liberation efforts. And that gay liberation efforts in Madison occurred in the fall of '69, just months after Stonewall, at St. Francis House, which was the campus Episcopal Center, shown here in a contemporary photo, and where the Madison Alliance for Homosexual Equality met in that fall of 1969. They would have posters that they would put out like Gay Liberation Loves You Very Much, and note that their meetings occurred at St. Francis House, as this poster notes, every Wednesday at 8 o'clock. And St. Francis House was sort of a hovering guardian angel for the early gay movement in the city as well. They would later provide some office space in the basement and provide an initial loan for the gay center so it could hire some staff. So it was an important historical place on what I have termed the pink plaque tour of Madison, of places that are particularly associated with gay liberation and gay history in this city. The Gay Center was a very active group. They did social activities. So you see here a poster for the picnic that they're presenting. In part, they were trying to provide some non-bar alternatives. There were a few bars where gays could congregate, but not particularly totally gay friendly. Note the little badger or fox, I'm not quite sure, has a lambda on the crest. And they also had a phone line. And this was very important in early gay liberation circles because information about homosexuality had been largely suppressed or was terribly negative. And so trying to provide positive information was an important activity of these many gay organizations at the beginning. And the Gay Center would host over the Thanksgiving weekend in 1971 a gay conference that would be held at the Memorial Union. which was otherwise closed for student activities during that period. And groups from all across the country would come. And so Madison was helping bring some of these groups together to form a national agenda and exchanging ideas. In Milwaukee, the Gay People's Union, or GPU, was the prime organization, which was founded following Stonewall. It doesn't really sort of get organized much until the following spring. But they also were active and were involved in hosting in 1972 the Midwest Homophile Convention, homophile being the early pre-Stonewall name for many gay organizations. And so again, another Wisconsin city was taking a lead, trying to get folks together to help shape this new movement that was occurring post-Stonewall. Now, a lot of that early activity, both at Mayhe and at GPU, was dominated by gay males. And so the lesbian community felt a need for separate effort. And so they began to form their own groups that were often in Madison associated with the University Y. They sometimes referred to themselves as Gay Sisters. This was a poster for their meetings, which they often met at 10 Langdon, which was sort of a co-op-y space back then, and they shared space with other groups that were sort of countercultural at 10 Langdon. But they were very involved in helping plan gay arts. And later on, the sort of same sense of women needing to organize was manifested in Madison with Lysistrata, which was a women's space for both food and social bar, but it also for community organizing. Ruth Blyer was one of the supporters and organizers of that early women's community, shown here before a banner for Lysistrata. Now, as I mentioned, there was tremendous dearth of information about homosexuality in the general culture and within the community itself. And so an important aspect of the Wisconsin effort to organize and to gain standing in the broader community in the state was gay media. And here's a picture of a young Ron McCrae and the Renaissance newsletter, which he was editor of for a while. This was an early effort that was put out by the Gay Center. You see that little gay logo up at the top, which was surrounded what sort of a rainbow sunrise kind of thing, but it was in black and white, so you didn't get the full rainbow effect. And it struggled. This was a 3-month issue because they had skipped a couple months. And so, but you see here, this was an article that McCrae himself had done with interviews with those who had survived the Madison Gay Purge, which had happened in 1962. And so this was the gay community bringing out the repression that they had suffered in trying to recapture their own history. And this sense that there was a community with a history and that history needed to be told is an important theme that I want to stress was significant. Amongst the other media that developed here was Gay Madison, and it's shown 2 editors, Peter Clem and Brooks Edgerton. Gay Madison had started initially as a newsletter for the United, and I'll talk a little bit more later about the United, but Brooks and Peter wanted to take a more independent stance than just being associated with a nonprofit organization. They wanted to delve more into political things, and so they wanted a separate newsletter or newspaper. So they created Gay Madison, which quickly morphed into Out, which was the prime statewide gay newspaper for almost half a decade. In Milwaukee, part of the community was covered in the underground press. The Bugle American was the alternative press in Milwaukee. And they did a whole special issue on Milwaukee's gay scene in '75. And they had articles like Banishing the Gay Stereotype. And they had a photo amongst that showed a homosexual kissing booth at the Brady Street Festival on Milwaukee's east side. The cover of that Bugle American showed a whole series of people who would have been recognizable to early Milwaukee gay and lesbian community. And part of that cartoon effort was led by Dennis Kitchen, who was one of the editors of the Bugle American and he was from Racine. We'll talk about Dennis some more a little bit later too. The big publication coming out of Milwaukee was GPU News, and the spark plug behind it was Eldon Murray, shown here sort of in his newsroom with volunteers doing paste ups for GPU News. That magazine lasted a decade and was really informative, helping define where the parameters of the community were, helping provide information about activities and other information from across the nation, really. It had both about half its subscribers in state and half nationally outside the state, even exchanged with libraries in Japan. Dennis, he was a stockbroker. Eldon was a stockbroker, and he said Steins didn't care if he was gay just as long as they made money. He had been an activist in the Milwaukee community and getting GPU organized. He was one of the original 5 signers for the GPU. And they'd had trouble just getting a bank to give them a bank account. So much was the homophobia that they faced in their initial efforts. Eventually, the magazine separated from GPU itself as an organization. And Dennis carried it on with his happy band of volunteers. One of the contributors to GPU News was Lou, who was very active in the trans community, the female to male trans community. Lou Sullivan was a contributor to GP News on several trans articles during the 70s, and then he went on to organize nationally on behalf of the female to male trans community, and even wrote a book about an early trans pioneer in San Francisco. Unfortunately, as he would later say, he had a lot of difficulty trying to convince the medical community that he could be a trans person and a gay man, since it was not assumed to be a commonality at the time. And that was part of the struggle that he had to do for medical education. I mentioned Dennis Kitchen with the Underground Press. One of the things that he did was also put out alternative comics, and he had moved his publishing operation up to Princeton, Wisconsin. And so he expanded the sort of underground comics to include comics for women, which hadn't been much done at that point, and also to have gay comics. The first 4 issues of gay comics were actually published from Princeton, Wisconsin, before it moved elsewhere in the nation. There were other publications in the state that was a very fertile and active field. You had In Step, which came out of Milwaukee. Originally started as a bar rag, but expanded to be much more than that, though they still have pretty good coverage on the social life of the state's community. And then you had Hag Rag, which also started from Milwaukee, proudly describing itself as Wisconsin's feminist press. It was actually followed by, it had many of the same people who had been part of Amazon, which had been a women's magazine published in Milwaukee that had not been expressly lesbian, but had a lot of lesbian content. And so they had a lot of good fun with issues like Dykes to Watch Out For in this particular issue that we're highlighting here. Also, it wasn't just limited to the major areas. Over in La Crosse, you had this wonderful newsletter, Leaping La Crosse News, which was put out by a very active feminist lesbian community in the western part of the state. This particular issue highlights their 4th annual Tux Party. For about a decade, they had these annual Tux Parties where members of the community would dress off and show how fine they could look in their tuxes. And many other social activities, women music activities that they sponsored for Western Wisconsin as well. I mentioned the Gay People's Union. They had a lot of social activities as well. They had this cruise on the River Queen, and they had an all-girl band. And you might note that the proceeds for this particular event that the GPU is sponsoring are going for the Safransky Defense Fund. The Safransky case was very important in the state. In 1972, Paul Safransky was fired from Southern Colony, where he was a house parent at this state institution, because the superintendent of Southern Colony did not want any homosexuals on his staff, or in fact, as even patients at Southern Colony. And so Safransky, being the new kind of homosexual, not the sort of one who would go quietly away, appealed his firing. It turned out that actually the superintendent had fired at least 4 other homosexuals, and all of them had gone quietly. But as part of the new act of homosexuals, Safransky refused that, and he appealed to the state personnel board. The Wisconsin Civil Liberties Union initially gave support for the case, but then they withdrew toward at a later stage, which is why the GPU News carried this article about the Wisconsin Civil Liberties Union lets down gays. But nevertheless, the case was argued in front of the personnel board and then in front of the Dane County Circuit Court, and then was appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. Amongst the things that had happened along the way was that the personnel board had made a finding that the firing was okay because homosexuality was contrary to general standards of morality. This was not acceptable to some members of the gay community, like Professor David Adamany, who was a professor of constitutional law and political science at the university. And so he filed an amicus brief with the Wisconsin Supreme Court, arguing for the constitutional rights of homosexuals, and that you could not make such a broad statement as the personnel board had made. He correctly pointed out that homosexuality itself was not illegal in Wisconsin, even though some homosexual acts were under state law. And he also argued that the personnel board had no particular expertise to make a determination about what was the standard of morality in the state, nor had they taken any evidentiary testimony or created a record for such. So the Supreme Court decision, when it came down, was a split decision. It agreed with Adamany that to strike the personnel board's finding about homosexuality in general, which would have applied to any homosexual then in employment. But they did agree to uphold the firing of Paul Safransky in the particular instance because he failed to present the proper image of a male house parent, though this was very questionable, as if it might have been okay if he had been quiet about who he was rather than being open about who he was. But while this was going on as one of the fights in the early state for a couple of years in the press and in the courts, meanwhile, activists were beginning to take another tack. Grid Hall, shown here, I think that's probably either Vilas or James Madison Park Beach, began working with the Madison Equal Opportunities Commission to change the Madison ordinances to include sexual orientation amongst the classes that could not be discriminated against. He was involved with the Gay Law Students Association. Another person involved in this effort was Carla Dubinsky. And they appeared for about a year and a half at the Madison EOC meetings and pled their case, worked on refining the language. In 1975, Madison would adopt that language and became one of the first sort of dozen or so cities in the country to have equal protections in non-discrimination based on sexual orientation. It was happily supported by Mayor Paul Soglin, and he worked with the EOC director, Jim Wright, who was also a pastor at the Mount Zion Baptist Church, one of the leading African-American churches in Madison, to try and get the ordinance to have broad support, and it passed without really significant debate at all at the Madison City Council. But once such ordinances were beginning to be adopted around the country, a threat arose to attack such ordinances. The threat came from Anita Bryant, who was the Orange Juice spokesperson. And so this poster for an anti-Anita Bryant bash, which was to be held at Great Hall Memorial Union, featured a orange and of course had orange paper, and was supporting the fight to not repeal such ordinances as Madison and Dade County had created. Unfortunately, Dade County fight was lost, and many others were lost around the country as well. And so there was real concern that perhaps Madison's ordinance might be repealed when some local ministers began an effort to do so. To fight back, an organization by the name of the United was formed to take political action. And the Gay Center itself was more of a social service organization, and so the United was more of a political organization at that point. And they, in one of their reports, had that slogan from a letter from James Baldwin to Angela Davis: if they take you in the morning, they will be coming for us that night, to talk about the intersectionality of the support for non-discrimination across all the classes. Barbara Leitner was an early activist and organizer and staff for the United, often spoke at rallies here in Madison to the community. While this was sort of the political organizing, there was also another crew in Madison, and that was sort of termed the Party Hardy Boys. Rodney Shield was their sort of leader. He's shown here with a bullhorn at the picnic in Brittingham Park, which he had sponsored to reward his bar patrons in the summer. This would become the Magic Picnic, which was standing for the Madison Gay Interim Committee, and became sort of the annual summer festival for Madison's gay community. But Rodney was helping mobilize those more social types rather than the political types for the effort to fight the repeal of Madison's ordinance. The fight for the repeal was successful. The EOC recommended no changes. The Madison Council did no changes. And so Madison was one of the few places in the country early on that turned back the fight to repeal non-discrimination ordinances. Excuse me. Next, I'm going to turn to the state level. And the early prophet for sex reform in the state was Lloyd Barbie. He was an African-American. He was head of the NAACP chapters variously in Madison and I believe statewide. He led the fight for Milwaukee school integration court cases. And he was a reforming type legislator. He introduced right on in his first session a bill to decriminalize homosexual activity. Right after Stonewall in '69, in the next session, which began in '71, after he got reelected in 1970, he had introduced bills to ban discrimination based on sexual orientation. He also introduced a bill to permit same-sex marriage and marriage equality, maybe one of the first of those in the nation. And so he was a prophet in this area. And so he was known for a fight that he had when he was running for re-election in 1974, sometimes termed the God election, when he was attacked for introducing such bills in favor of gays. And Barbie was right out front of it. He would have a regular column in the Milwaukee Courier, the African-American newspaper in Milwaukee, about all of his fights for rights for gays as well as for African-Americans. And he was challenged in this Democratic primary, but was successful in turning back the challenge. He would then pass the baton to another state representative, David Clarenbach, who became the prime advocate for sex reform and gay issues in the Wisconsin legislature. David and Lloyd were good friends, and sometimes David would go down to a resort that Lloyd had in Jamaica. And so their friendship, both political and personal, was a strong one. Here you see both of them, Barbie standing next to Governor Lucy, David off to the far right for the signing of Wisconsin's ratification of the Equal Rights Bill, along with some women legislators as well. So momentum was building at the state level to do something. And the fight was primarily initially about consenting adults, to repeal the criminal statutes, because as long as people were doing activities that were thought to be criminal, it was felt okay that you could discriminate against them. Now, other people who joined that fight in the legislature were Dick Flintrop, who was a Democratic representative from Oshkosh, and Steve Gunderson, who was a representative from up near the Eau Claire area. Steve was a Republican. And both of them and Clarenbach lent their names to be used for the Coalition for Sexual Privacy, which became the advocacy group for repeal of the sex laws and for the passage of a consenting adults law in Wisconsin. And so this argument about sexual privacy was an important strategic positioning of the Wisconsin effort for reform of the sex laws. In our neighboring state of Minnesota, I would talk to some of the officials there, and they would talk about their efforts to repeal sodomy as their primary focus. Didn't have quite the same ring as consenting adults, because under Wisconsin law, even acts committed by heterosexuals, if they were those same acts, could be prosecuted. Though it was thought that maybe they weren't. or that any of these morality laws weren't prosecuted. One of the persons who took on that argument directly was Louis Crew, shown here in the back with his partner in front, Ernest Clay. Louis was a professor at the University of Stevens Point, and he did a survey of district attorneys in the state about how and whether they were enforcing the laws against homosexuality, and found out that indeed many of them were and were glad to do that. And so the argument that such laws were only dead letters on the books fell by the wayside. But meanwhile, while the fight was going on over the consenting adults bill, there came a chance in the legislature, because the efforts to pass the consenting adults bill had been gaining momentum and had been gathering both Republican and Democratic votes. Remember, you had both Flintrop and Gunderson, Democratic and Republican representatives, who were supporting the effort, and Republicans were voting for the repeal of the morality laws and the passage of a consenting adults bill. But there came an effort when you had the support from the religious community for non-discrimination to pass a gay rights bill. And so Wisconsin in 1982 became the first state to pass a gay rights bill signed by Republican Governor Lee Dreyfus, shown here flanked by Representative David Clarenbach and Leon Rouse, who had organized the Committee for Fundamental Judeo-Christian Rights, which was a whole group of religious leaders who had supported the non-discrimination bill, including he had worked to get Archbishop Rembrandt Wycliffe and the Catholic Conference to support the bill, which they did. And so Clarenbach made the strong arguments. It was not about homosexuality that the legislature was debating. It was about discrimination and whether that was acceptable. Dreyfus bought the privacy argument, saying that it was very important to him that if you were able to discriminate against homosexuals, you had to violate the privacy of both heterosexuals and homosexuals to inquire about sexual orientation. So the strategy about a coalition for sexual privacy was a winning strategy, it turned out, in helping persuade Dreyfus to sign the bill. The following year, after Dreyfus was out of office, Governor Earl was able to sign the consenting adults bill, which repealed the legal discrimination against homosexuals. Shown here, he's handing a pen to State Representative David Clarenbach. I happen to be sort of behind the governor just by chance. And next to Clarenbach is Representative Marcia Coggs, who was Barbie's successor in the legislature and who had continued the fight that Barbie had started. Also in the background behind David is John Mansky, a Republican, again showing the bipartisan support that there was in the state in the 80s for these measures. Neither bill would have passed with just Democratic support. They needed Republican votes because there were certainly conservative Democrats who were opposed to these things. Now, in addition to this level of changing the state laws, and there was a whole series of laws that followed these two. There was a law protecting student rights against discrimination. There was also a law for HIV confidentiality. And there was a law about hate crimes that included sexual orientation. So these 5 bills all passed in the 1980s in the Wisconsin legislature under leadership and because of organizational effort within the community. It was a remarkable achievement. And it was one where Wisconsin was leading the country at that point in many of these issues. But another area that was important in the state became that of out elected officials. When the Gay Center had organized speakers to go out into the schools, Judy Greenspan had been invited by some of the students to speak in Madison, Wisconsin high school, and the principal turned her down. The school board supported the principals prohibiting any homosexuals speaking in the Madison high schools. And so Greenspan got around that by running for the school board. And so as a candidate, she was able to actually speak in the high schools, and she ran on a gay rights plank as an openly lesbian person. I think she's probably the first open lesbian candidate in the country. This is in 1973 and 74, an open lesbian would be elected in Michigan. But I don't believe anybody actually ran before Greenspan did in 73. She was followed, but even while she ran well in the primary, she didn't make it to the school board, by Alderman Jim Yaden, who got appointed to the city council to a vacancy in 1976 and then got elected himself in an election in the spring of 77. So he was elected to the Madison City Council before Harvey Milk got elected to the San Francisco City Council. Yaden would be the out 4th official in the country. This active tradition of running and getting elected as out elected officials was continued in Madison, was strengthened in part by Jim McFarland, who became the second out Republican in the country, the other one being a town clerk in Massachusetts, when McFarland got elected to the city council representing the same district that Yaden had represented, the Fraternity Road, Langdon Street area. There were others who were following those same footsteps. Here are 3 out county board members, myself in the center, flanked by Kathleen Nichols on the right, and a very young Tammy Baldwin on the left. We were all elected officials from Wisconsin marching at the National Gay Pride Parade, and we were proclaiming from Wisconsin the gay rights state. Some of the delegation from Wisconsin was chanting the first gay rights state, first state, first state. Folks in Delaware were a little upset because they always claimed first state status as being the first to ratify the US Constitution. Nevertheless, we proudly proclaimed it. And Kathleen and I would go on to help organize the first national conference of out elected officials in West Hollywood in 1985, which later would morph into the Victory Fund. In 1989, we hosted that conference of out elected officials here in Madison. And on the invite, we posed this photograph with the Gay Liberation statue, which was located in Orton Park. It's now in Sheridan Square in New York, but New York was not ready to receive it. And so Madison gave it a friendly host for a number of years. But myself, Jim McFarland, City Council, Earl Bricker from the County Board, Ricardo Gonzalez from the City Council, Kathleen from the County Board, and Tammy Baldwin from the County Board. So we had 10% of the City Council, 10% of the County Board. Was remarkable representation, more than any place else in the nation at that point for out elected folks. So Wisconsin was making progress on many fronts. One of the other areas where great progress was made was when Tony Earl got elected governor in 1982. Tony had actively sought the gay community support. He did an extensive interview with OUT, and he had promised that he would have connections to the gay community, including a potential liaison. And one of the things that he did was he appointed Ron McCray as his press secretary. And the Milwaukee Sentinel ran with the headline, "Avowed Homosexual Appointed by the Governor," as if this was a huge scandal. McCray actually offered to Earl to withdraw his name if the governor wanted to do that. Earl flatly refused and said, "If I can't stand a kerfuffle like this, how am I going to stand a real crisis?" And so McCray served 4 years as an admirable press secretary for Tony Earl. Earl did eventually appoint a liaison. Earl Bricker became the liaison. He also appointed the Governor's Council on Lesbian and Gay Issues, as you noted. And the map shows where that council met around the state. At the first meeting, David Clarenbach charged the council to go out and take the issue of gay and lesbian recognition and support to the village square. We didn't quite get to all the village squares, but we did get around the state. And the pattern of these meetings was where we would use the stationery from the governor's office to invite local officials to a meeting. And we would also invite local gay and lesbian community folks to meet. And often this was the first time these folks had ever been together. And we would pose questions about what kind of services were being provided for gays and lesbians in the area, what kind of complaints the community had. And so these dialogues began in a way that had never occurred before the Governor's Council existed. The council also worked with state agencies to update their documents so that they reflected the new state law providing non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. It worked with the statewide Wisconsin Press Association and on other issues, which I'll talk about in a bit. One of the people who came and spoke to the early council meetings was Fran Tryon, shown here. She was director of the Equal Rights Division of the Department of Industry, Labor, and Human Relations. And so she was charged with implementing the new law. And here you see April 1983, Fair Employment for Lesbians and Gay Men. This was a new pamphlet that the Equal Rights Division put out, implementing the new law, trying to get people aware of it. She became an advocate for the law, talked about its workability and its importance, and she was invited to speak to other legislatures around the country. This was how Wisconsin, as a laboratory for gay democracy, was showing how it could be done, figuring out itself. She had to give training to her staff in the Equal Rights Division so that they would be comfortable dealing with gay and lesbian issues. This was not immediately evident with some of them. And so, and she talked about very meaningfully with members of the council about how if you were gay or lesbian, when you wanted to file a complaint, you were sort of not filing just to talk the discrimination, but you were also outing your own identity. And that if you were a woman or person of color, the basis of your complaint was evident. But if you came in to file one based on sexual orientation, you had to begin to talk about who you were, which was not often the case for people claiming discrimination in other areas. And it did show that gays and lesbians, while they did file complaints, and many were settled successfully with remunerative findings on behalf of those discriminated against, there was this lower participation on that basis of sexual orientation in the enforcement than in some other categories compared to the likely population of the state. But again, Wisconsin was leading the way, trying to figure out how these new laws could work in a state. It was almost a decade before another state had such a law that they could follow the example. Another thing that happened was because of you had a favorable governor and you had a governor's council, was that Governor Earl arranged for the Division of Health Administrator, Katie Morrison, to set up a meeting with the Wisconsin Medical Society with myself and Kathleen Nichols, because one of the things the Governor's Council had done at its very first meeting was adopt a resolution about AIDS and its concern for funding for that. And so we met with Earl Thayer, who's the second from left in this photo, who is director of the State Medical Society, and early on got them on board about a positive response to the AIDS crisis in the state. So we were able to avoid some of the insensitive treatments that had occurred in some other places on the coast where the disease had reared its head earlier than in Wisconsin. So the Medical Society adopted a statement and sent it out in its its monthly magazine to all the doctors in the state. They talked about cooperating with the community centers around the state and the gay community for counseling. And so we built a partnership there that was very important. We also sponsored in '84, and this is before before President Reagan could even get around in a couple of years to mentioning AIDS, the Great Lakes Lesbian Health Conference, for which Governor Earl had issued that proclamation seen in the prior photo with Earl Thayer. I myself went off to the War Conference, which was held, I'm sort of the third from the left of the back row, to talk about what we would do as a community faced with the crisis of homophobia and AIDS, which was literally killing the community at that point. So this was an idea of Larry Kramer's that we needed to come together as a community and figure out some national strategies. Out of this came out National Coming Out Day and other exchanges of information across the country. Of course, one of the other experiences of AIDS was the memorial quilt. I happened to be able to read for the unfolding of the quilt on the National Mall. This shows portions of the quilt that were in the field house here in Madison. Wisconsin also had ACT UP chapters in Milwaukee and in Madison. Here's the Madison chapter delivering peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to Governor Tommy Thompson's office because the Wisconsin prisons had isolated AIDS persons, wouldn't let them circulate in the general population and get to the nutritious meals that might be available. Instead, provided them with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, which was hardly a healthy diet. And so the AIDS activist ACT UP pelted the governor's office with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to protest this treatment in the Wisconsin prisons. Another effort that occurred in Milwaukee, which was showing the expansiveness of the community, was Black and White Men Together Milwaukee. There was an active chapter for several decades there. They even hosted a national conference. Shown here are two people from that Milwaukee chapter, including Mike Lukowski on the right. And behind them is Bayard Rustin, the great civil rights activist who was also a gay person who participated in Black and White Men nationally, and who was just recently announced that Michelle and Barack Obama are going to produce a documentary video about Bayard Rustin's remarkable life as a gay man and a civil rights activist. In addition, besides fighting some of the racism in the community, there were also groups that were forming like Bi Shy Y, advocating for bisexuals as part of the community. This happens more in the 90s than it does in the 80s. And they carried banners marching in national marches as well. They put out publications like Bylines, which was published on the Madison campus. There was also a bi group that organized over in Milwaukee as well in the 90s. You had activity occurring around the state. Mike Fitzpatrick here was a key spark plug in the Green Bay area. He was for many years editor of Positive Voice, which was the newsletter for the Green Bay community. He later became an activist for the Center Project, an AIDS project in the northwest of Wisconsin, and was involved in the early board of Action Wisconsin, which later became Fair Wisconsin. A long history of activism and understanding in the Northeast Wisconsin community. Also in Northeast Wisconsin, you had the educational television effort, which was undertaken by the CISA district up there for programming for gay teens and their parents. These programs were aired nationally over educational television and won a gold medal from the national system for their wonderful efforts and pioneering efforts to help provide educational materials for younger people. Additionally, Milwaukee was a big sports town, and so you had a lot of sports activities within the gay community in Milwaukee. The Saturday Softball League held a tournament. In this case, the InStep magazine is publishing the Rec Room Classic. It was named after one of the bars that was the sponsor of the tournament. It drew teams from all over the Midwest for a tournament which was held in Milwaukee and rotated around some other cities as well. Saturday Softball League ended up with a booth at the Brewers, which ended up with a fair amount of revenue, which helped to support gay sports in the Milwaukee area. They felt that gay sports were an easy way for people to gain access to the community. You had the Lesbian Alliance of Milwaukee, where the lesbian community in that major city also felt there was need to have a separate organization for their voice to be heard. And they were very active again for about a decade or so, known as LAM. Now, Milwaukee is also the bowling capital of the nation, as well as the state. Think Laverne and Shirley, bowling for the brewery team. And so you had gay bowling teams that appeared in Milwaukee. And actually, there was gay tournaments for bowling that they hosted, and there was a traditional tournament between Madison and Milwaukee gay bowlers as well. Thinking of Milwaukee as well, being a Harley-Davidson motorcycle city, you had the Argonauts, which was a gay cycle club, still active, one of the longest organizations in the state, has an annual run, or has had one up near Chilton up in the northeastern part of the state. You had gay arts flourishing elsewhere up near Ladysmith, Chalice Stream, which had two dancers, Barry Lynn, who lived almost to 100, while performing his interpretations of modern dance, and his partner, Michael Doran. They were recognized by the Eau Claire Arts Council for their pioneering efforts in that part of the state. Down in Racine, one of the activists was Tony Larson. He had been testifying as far back as the 1970s and 80s for various gay legislation at state hearings, and was leading here a more recent gay rights parade for Racine. He was with the Unitarian Church, and the Unitarian Universal Church had been active supporting the gay community in that area. In Eau Claire, you had an out gay professor, Bob Nolan. When he was hired and indicated he was really an out person, his dean originally had suggested perhaps he might want to live in the Twin Cities rather than Eau Claire. He was having none of it. He began to raise issues about the campus and its responsibilities for gay issues, and helped establish a very friendly atmosphere for the Eau Claire campus community. As I mentioned, National Coming Out Day was one of the strategies that came out of the war conference. Here was Bascom Hill with pink triangles. That was part of National Coming Out Day. activities that was undertaken by the 10% Society. You got folks doing history of the community. Pat Kalchina did this lesbian history course. There were also gay history courses done over in Milwaukee that were sponsored as part of the sort of the Free University over there in Milwaukee. And so the community began to know its stories and its tales. It almost seemed to become normal. The State Journal could finally run a story about the gays next door and note that the Midwest, with Wisconsin leading the way, has shown the largest increase in people identifying themselves as same-sex couples. So with that, perhaps maybe we're ready for questions and we can talk about the book.
Yes, perhaps some of the people missed when I said, please write any questions in the chat as we're going, but you can do it now. I'll give you a couple of minutes to write questions in the chat. Please do so, and we'll answer them as they come in. I suppose I'll start it out. I can ask a question.
You can ask questions, Susan.
Sure. So what do you see as our current challenges, and what do we need to yeah, I know it's
Go ahead. There are many.
it's quite a mess. Yes, I know. But okay, so how do you how would you like us, I mean, what do you think we need to focus on right now?
Well, I'm an historian, and part of my job was to try and recapture an earlier time, which I hope I did, because there certainly was bipartisan support for gay and lesbian issues back in that period. One of the unfortunate legacies of that period was because Wisconsin was so early, trans issues had not become part of what we were dealing with so much. And so the trans community was less included back then, and we didn't include trans rights amongst the basis of gender identity for for non-discrimination. So that's a big gap in our state law that needs to be covered. But I have little hope that the current legislature is likely to do anything with that. Primarily, and I served on the board of Fair Wisconsin for almost 6 years after the constitutional amendment fight. And we changed the focus to working on local community efforts rather than on state efforts because of the change, what had happened with the political communities in the state. And therefore, we felt that there was advances to be made, but they weren't going to be changes in state legislation anytime soon. Certainly, Governor Evers has changed some of the sense of the state government with his executive orders on non-discrimination. And also, it's very stirring to see the pride flag flying over state offices in the state capitol, which he has had state agencies do during the month of June.
Thank you. We do have someone here who would like to know a little bit more about Stonewall.
Sure. Stonewall was a gay bar down in Greenwich Village in New York City. It was popular with a young crowd, a street crowd. These were not sort of the homophile activists who were part of more established organizations, which did exist, though they were very small. But these were just folks who were out partying, and Stonewall was their place. The bar was being raided by the police, and they felt it was unfair that they were shutting down their social space where they could be free. And so they fought back. And so there was a series of nights of riots in New York City surrounding the bar and in Greenwich Village. I can remember going to get the Village Voice at our local newsstand, Snappy's, to read about all that was happening with this early gay liberation effort in New York City. But Stonewall became the signal for a new kind of gay activism. There had been stuff going on before. Some of the Californians argued that really gay liberation began on the West Coast before Stonewall happened in New York City. But Stonewall really sparked a whole new effort across the country. And so that sparked the efforts in Madison, it sparked the efforts in Milwaukee, and became a touchstone for people. And the first national march was to commemorate that anniversary of Stonewall.
Do you have a favorite story from the Wisconsin LGBT history?
Oh, there's lots of good stories, lots of good stories. I showed a slide of Ted Pierce. Uh, Ted Pierce was a gentleman who had gone to Madison East High School, and he had spent 2 years at the University of Wisconsin. His father had been, the term was the executive office usher. It was really sort of the person who greeted people who came to the governor's office. And Ted himself was appointed as that when his father passed away by Governor Philip Follett. And then after that, he worked in the Memorial Library for a number of years. But I got to know him personally, and he knew some of the people who lived in the house that I lived in. And so there became a connection between sort of the place that I lived in and some of the memories of the gay community activist who had lived here before I. And so he shared some of those photos and some of those stories with me. And so the continuity that I found between the early gay folks and myself as a gay activist in the later period. And then Ted and I would cross paths at various Frontiers events or other dinners. And so it's really showed the continuity across Stonewall was my relationship with Ted Pierce. And so that was one of the good stories I had.
Mhm. For sure. And I do want to add that PBS did a wonderful documentary on Stonewall, and I would encourage everyone to watch it. I saw it, I don't know, about a year ago or so, and it was just something else. It was really well done and gut-wrenching for sure. How many organizations that you talked about in your books are still active in Wisconsin?
Well, outreach is still around, and that's sort of the inheritor of the Gay Center. Q Law is still around, which was the Gay Law Students Association. The Argonauts is still around. I think the Saturday Softball League is still around, though, their season may have been shut down. And so there are a number of those kinds of remnant organizations around. But there tends to be a lot of turnover, and this was true during these periods of activists. You would have groups that would form, and originally it was the Madison Alliance for Homosexual Equality, and then it was the Gay Liberation Front, and then it was the Gay Center. And so there was sort of a short shelf life for both publications and organizations. They were all volunteer for the most part, and so that made it difficult to have stability. But still, there was remarkable ferment of activity that perked up. And I do have a chapter all around the state, which talks about how the activity occurred in both large and small places, rural and urban. And many of those places outstate, that they knew that they had the state laws. And so that empowered them to become activists in their own communities. And one of the things that was surprising to me was that AIDS activist in Minnesota urged people to get the test for AIDS in the state of Wisconsin rather than in their own Minnesota. They were supposed to cross the border because Wisconsin had confidentiality for test results, and it also had non-discrimination for homosexuals. And in Minnesota, you couldn't be sure the test would be confidential, and it might be used as a marker for homosexuality, and you might be fired because there were no protections in Minnesota. So it again showed how Wisconsin's leadership made a difference in the status for people in the state, that sort of laboratory for democracy effect that I was talking about.
Absolutely. One person says, thank you so much for all your hard work and research, and especially for including the bi community in this presentation. I've spent most of my life feeling starved for bi history and stories. Can you speak further about how bisexuality fit into conversations that were happening during these decades? Were there any openly bi leaders within the gay rights movement?
There are two ways that occurred. There were these bi organizations that become more prominent in the 1990s. and there becomes some press coverage of sexual fluidity and by individuals. And then there are a number of people who were gay activists who actually had bisexual lives themselves at various points in their lives. Ron McKay and Kathleen Nichols had both same-sex and opposite-sex relationships. And so there are things there. It was less prominent than gays and lesbians, who were more visible and more in the forefront of organizing. I'm not quite sure the full reasons for that, since actually there are probably many more bisexuals numerically, according to the statistics in Kinsey, than there are perfect homosexuals or lesbians. But that's the reality of the historical record as I came across it.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the work of Kinsey. Could you explain that for people who aren't familiar with that name?
Sure. Alfred Kinsey was a researcher with the University of Indiana. He founded what's now known as the Kinsey Institute, which became the first sort of sex research place in the country. There were a number of academics before Kinsey who did some research, and in my book, particularly volume 1, I cover some of the Wisconsin academics who did some research about homosexuality. But Kinsey shocked the nation when he published Male Sexuality in 1947, and then followed it up with Female Sexuality a couple years after. He described that as many as 10% of the people might be exclusively homosexual for most of their lives, and that a much larger number had experimented with homosexuality over their lives. And these statistics just shocked people because they had thought it was maybe perhaps a few oddballs rather than a significant share of the population. So the Kinsey studies caused a new uproar about homosexuality. And in fact, on the UW-Madison campus, they talked about an outbreak of homosexuality that they had experienced, which I talk about in volume 1, which was related to the whole sense that the Kinsey study had revealed that there was a lot more of it going on than people had originally thought.
Yes. Angela Davis mentions that trans Black women are among the most marginalized of all. Can you comment on this?
I certainly agree with that sentiment. Partially, the problem is, of course, they're suffering from double discrimination in terms of the being a part of the female community, which is discriminated against economically and socially, and then being part of the African American community, which is also discriminated against racially and economically as well. And so they're just sort of having to really fight more than most people. And again, it's lack of knowledge. One of the things that was important to me was the role of the press, our own community press in the state, in trying to uncover the stories, the true stories about gays and lesbians and bisexuals and trans people a little bit. In that there's tremendous ignorance in the larger community, tremendous ignorance within our own communities. I can recall when I was a graduate student doing research on my dissertation, which was on some reformers who were trying to end prostitution. I would be in the stacks at Memorial Library, and I would be in the section on social deviance, which is where the prostitution volumes were filed. But it's also where the volumes on homosexuality were filed. And I would never think when I was in graduate school of taking out one of the volumes on homosexuality, but I could slide down and look at them. And they were all pretty awful stuff, mainly written about psychologists who were trying to treat for sickness. And so to have a body of literature that's positive and affirming about your lives is an important thing for anybody that's been in a discriminated community. And so that's part of what we as a larger society need to encourage, is that those voices become heard and documented if we're to change our attitudes towards the most marginalized.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, we did talk about how laws for trans people are something we need to be working on right now. What are other issues today that should be addressed?
Well, there's a whole question about the sensitivity of services and healthcare issues that, that just because you have non-discrimination doesn't mean all of a sudden everybody's enlightened about how to deal with things. So educating people, I mean, I can recall in the early days when I went to a doctor, they had no idea about how to take a sexual history so that they could be informed about proper care for an individual. So there's a lot of effort needs to be made to open up society in ways so that they understand the issues that folks face. Part of what I cover in the volume 2 is also the early efforts in some of the schools to change some of the relationships about educational status and bringing gay and lesbian materials, and presumably that would include nowadays trans materials, into the schools. Part of this project of these 2 volumes is going to be followed by another publication by the State Historical Society Press, which is going to be a volume that's aimed for high school students and teachers. And that should be coming out sometime this year yet, which will help give a resource for gay and lesbian history for teachers in the state. So there's a lot more that needs to be done to change the ignorance that's been so abominable about our community.
Sure. Someone would like you to talk more about your books.
Okay.
I think you did.
All right. Well, the book.
What else?
Locker. And so when I started working on thinking that there was a book, I started gathering those 40 boxes, and then I probably doubled that with another 40 boxes of research. And I've donated those to the University Madison Archives, by the way. So I began to find leads and put together a story. And then I sat down with the editors at the Society Press, and I gave them an outline for a 2-volume history. They weren't inclined at the first to the multi-volume concept, but I sort of pushed and said, well, how many books about non-homosexual history have you published? That maybe 2 might not help balance it out a little bit. So they finally agreed. And some friends of mine were very enthusiastic and went out and raised some money to support the project. And we've even made some contacts with or PBS Wisconsin now for them doing a documentary based on some of the work and some additional research that their own staff is undertaking. It's been a long project for me. I was encouraged by writing columns for Our Lives magazine, where I was able to test out some materials early on in the pages of Our Lives. And so finally it all came together.
For sure. So someone is asking, what states are leading right now in gay rights? And do you still consider Wisconsin to be a leader in gay rights?
No, Wisconsin is no longer the leader that it was, but considering half the states don't even have any non-discrimination laws, we're still in sort of the better part of the nation's states. But some of the states that are probably more favorable these days would include California, Oregon, and some of the West Coast and East Coast states. So, yeah, nevertheless, we still have elected the first out US Senator in the nation, and we have an out elected congressman who succeeded her. So that's something no other state has done. So we're not slouching off totally by any means.
Good. Are there any other questions? Those are the only ones I see in the chat box. If you do have other questions that you think of after this presentation is over, please send them to Amy and she will send them on to Dick if they are addressed to Dick or to me. I'm sure they'll be addressed to Dick, but please send them to Amy and she will pass them on to Dick.
Sure.
There is one last question. What can we allies do to advocate at the state and local level?
It's very important to sustain community activities. I know organizations like Outreach and Fair Wisconsin and other groups like them. There's Parents and Friends of Gays and Lesbians organizations in some places in the state. All operate on very meager resources, and anything you can do to help them, I'm sure, is appreciated. Also, just be willing to speak up if you hear nasty jokes about members of the community and indicate that that's not something you really appreciate. It's important work for all of us. Part of what I find as an historian is that unfortunately, all too often, community history is primarily written by those who are in the community because they feel most affected by it. It's really all of our history, the story of how Wisconsin's LGBT folks fought for their rights is a story of our democracy. It's not just a story of a special pleading of a community. And so that story needs to be told with the pride in our democracy, not just as a special interest.
Okay, one last question here. Where do Texas and Alaska stand on gay rights?
Texas is not good. I don't know much about Alaska one way or the other, but I'm not persuaded that it's necessarily right up at the top.
Mm-hmm. Well, after this is over, we do go into the what to do slides, but there is one question about organizations available for youth and for adults.
There is a group called G-Safe, which is based here in Madison, which helps organize gay-straight alliances in the schools. That's a very important group and activity. I've been to some of their annual dinners. They're always very inspiring about the efforts they're able to achieve for equality and acceptance within the school systems. There's also a group, Diverse and Resilient, which helps provide resources for some of the same young folks in community. And so try and find those resources and help build them in your community. If there isn't a Gay Straight Alliance or a similar kind of group in your schools, you could try and help build one up.
Okay, I think we can move on to the what to do slides.
No problem.
And
I'll pull that up.
Thank you so much, Dick, for this presentation. Our community is very fortunate to have you here with us, and your books are incredible, just an incredible amount of scholarship and very enjoyable reads. I mean, they are long books, so they do take a little bit of time, I know, but they're just so packed of detail and richness. So they in some ways they read more like a novel in terms of the, it's very, very smoothly written, but just so rich. So thank you so much.
I appreciate that.
Okay. And we do want to say, I don't see the slides yet, but all of the middle and high schools in Janesville have gay straight alliances. So that's very important for our young people. And okay.
Susan, before we move on to the slides, Dick, is it okay instead of sending questions to me if I share your email address in the chat?
Sure, that's fine.
Thank you so much. I'll do that.
Okay, what to do? what to do, no matter if you are an ally, a friend, or just a person in the community, in the larger community, all of our cities, communities. First of all, what I want to really communicate is it's important to have an open mind and learn and know and connect. And that's true for all of us, no matter what our identities are. First of all, I have divided up some resources for people in Milwaukee, in Madison, and in Beloit, in our local area. In Milwaukee, in particular, I want to point out the Outwards Books, Gifts and Coffee. It's a book store that has been there for a very long time. It was a bookstore I went to a lot, and it was very helpful. It's a really helpful thing in the Milwaukee community, and they do have a website, so they might be able to. You may be able to purchase books that way. In Madison, as Dick said, the outreach is there, and there is a bi-monthly publication published there called Our Lives. Here, as we said before, we do have some activities in Beloit in particular. There is an LGBT book club that meets every fourth Saturday at the Bushel and Peck's. There is a game time for families on the third Saturday of the month, of every month, that meets at 400 East Grand Avenue. Every year there is Dorothy's Fire and Ice Ball in Beloit in March. And every year in August, the Rock County Pride Fest is held. I also want to tell people about this wonderful article by Jesus Nieto, published in the Teacher Education Quarterly Winter 2006, called The Cultural Plunge, Cultural Immersion as a Means of Promoting Self-Awareness and Cultural Sensitivity. For people, for adults, no matter who you are, no matter what your identity is, we need to learn more about one another. So I like to encourage people to get out and go into other social groups that you may not have walked into before. They are different than you. You may not know anything about them. You may feel uncomfortable, but please take a cultural plunge at least. I used to assign those when I was teaching college, and I really encourage all of us to take at least a cultural plunge every couple of months or so, and be with people that are new to you, and perhaps it's a whole different type of social group. So we need to learn more about one another as people. We need to connect and learn more about one another. Okay, and what can youth do? Okay, Dick mentioned G-Safe. Yes, that is the main one to really know about in Madison, because it does organize all of the gay straight alliances throughout the state of Wisconsin. It also helps develop leadership of LGBTQ students. And so that's very important. As I said, I really encourage people to learn more about it. Ignorance is our common enemy, and knowledge is power. And we all need more knowledge about one another. At the Beloit Public Library, they hold Rainbow movie series for all young people, and Rainbow Reads Book Club is held frequently as well. There's a lot of information at our own Hedberg Public Library about LGBTQ people, and so please go to your library and find out more information. There is a wonderful organization in Evansville called Building Safe Evansville, and they do have a website, so that's there for us. Within Janesville and the Beloit area, Janesville Mobilizing for Change. That's a wonderful organization. They do work with young people, but they work around many different issues in Janesville, and they do work with teens. So contact them if you are someone who is a high school person right now, college person who is struggling with your identity. Please contact them if you need someone to talk to right away. And with that, I believe we are finished. As we said before, next steps we need to take. There are future programs coming down the path here for Diversity Action Team. On Monday, the February 22nd, there will be a Courageous Conversations. It will be on Beloit's Black History, the Best Kept Secret. So that will be very interesting. The next DAT forum in March will be called The Color of Money. It is about racism in housing and employment. It will be held on March 18th. And again, if you have any more questions, send them in via email. Thank you, everyone, for attending this program. It was just such an honor to meet Dick and hear about his, and I've read his books, and so they are wonderful. Yes. So I encourage everyone to check them out. So, all right, thank you very much. Does anyone else have anything to say? If not, I guess we will bid you good night and see you again, hopefully. So, all right. Thank you.